So I was hoping, Mr. Q-052, that you could bring us back to the youngest Q-052 you can remember being and tell us a little bit about what it sounded like to be you before you had any control over the sounds.
Absolutely, man. And I love that perspective, and I like that nostalgic, reverse into the early days, right? And you're right. Too many people jump into, I'm into hip hop, and that's bullshit most of the time, right? Nobody's just into hip hop unless you're probably from New York, right? But
Now, even then,
yeah,
all they moms and stuff was into like soul or this or that.
yeah, there's R&B going on. There's all this going on. For me, I'm growing up on the on the East Coast in the 80s, before cable, before any of this shit. I had 3 channels on the television, okay, right up until I was like 14 years old over there. We didn't have that fucking stuff, so we didn't have that direct connection. When I was on the reserve, connection to city life and all of that wasn't happening, man. I grew up on Hank Williams Sr., okay, Conway Twitty, the old school country. My father was a day school survivor, so like the residential
Right,
schools.
right.
So in those schools, he had no choice. He had to learn to play instruments. So he played guitar, he played piano, we played all kinds of fucking stuff, right? And when I was growing up, him and his buddies would always be at our place playing cards, playing guitars, right? So country music, that's really, really where it comes from. And we didn't have a connection to hip hop within our community, not on the East Coast, not until we got much older and shit started coming out in the 90s, right? So we started having access stuff. We didn't have the internet either. So we didn't have devices in order to gain that type of knowledge. But there was a few people in our community, like myself and a few others who were of mixed blood, you know what I mean? So I was going back and forth to the Boston area. So when I would leave the reserve and go over there, now I'd be immersed in a whole new culture, right? And when I was staying on that side, it was on Palm Street in Nashua, New Hampshire. Now, if you go to Palm Street in Nashua, you find it's the ghetto, right? So it's all the poor families living in these places. So Puerto Rican and Black community and Indigenous people. There's like a lot of Indigenous people over there. And so then we started listening to hip hop. This is where I started listening to hip hop. And, so my musical taste, and I have older brothers, right? And these guys grew up listening to CCR and Zeppelin and all of these bands, all the metal bands, right? And so I got a touch of all of that, man. I got a little bit of all of that. And even when I'm performing music now, I'm doing all of it.
Yeah, I noticed you have the band and you kind of hop around genres, and it's really interesting to hear that. So basically, if I understand it correctly, then your dad was forced to play instruments due to the way that the school system back then worked, which I had no idea that that was even a thing. But that turned
Yep.
everybody into a musician and had everybody kind of jamming out back home. And then for some reason it's country, which I guess if you're not in the city makes sense. Fair enough. It's not my favorite genre, but I understand. Um,
Man, you go on to the reserves on the East Coast, and it's mostly country. You actually go to the reserves in Innu communities in the North and whatnot. You know what the strongest genre of music is with Indigenous people is folk and country. This is the most popular music for
mm,
Indigenous people. A lot more than hip hop or
you know what? When
electronic.
you say it next to folk music like that, and you realize that like folk and country are kind of cousins,
Yeah,
folk is way doper to me. But okay, I get what you're
but
saying.
it's got that country swag to it, right? It's got the same type of instruments. The thing with the folk though is you get a lot of the switch over, right? So you get a lot of the more drum beat from indigenous communities, and country don't have that so much, right? It's just so there's a different vibe to it, but that folk adds that drum beat, and that's why you see so many indigenous people into that drum beat,
Mm.
into the folk music. But yeah, man, even right now, you go into Giskabigia, you go to my community, or you go to Listigoch, sister community, or any of the communities around Mi'kma'ki, country music is going to be the
What
driving
is
force.
it? The old country or is it the new hip hop country?
It is the old country first and foremost, and then you have the Bayou music, right? Because our relationship on the East Coast is really close with the Acadian people. The
Mm.
Acadian people are the Cajuns that you call down south.
Right,
Them
right.
Cajuns, so it's the same people. So the roots of their music are very tied into ours, and the interest in our communities are so tied into each other. You know that the Mi'kmaq, when they did the deportation of Acadian people to send them down south and just get them out of here, a lot of Mi'kmaq men went with those Acadian women because they had already formed families together, right? So you can go down to Louisiana right now, and you can Lafayette, and you're gonna find Mi'kmaq people, Indigenous families there because they got deported with them. And right now, my wife is Acadian, right, and I have 5 children with her. If they were ever to send her anywhere, there's not a fucking chance in hell I ain't going. I'm going too. So that's why you see our spread out there. Back to the point is that Bayou music, that Cajun style music, you find that in the Mi'kmaq music as well.
Dude, that's
You know, so
super. I love the
like
context you're giving. Because, you know,
yeah, and CCR, Creedence Clearwater Revival, like that type of vibe, and all of these guys that are coming. Brother Dedge, if you listen to Brother Dedge, it's a fucking great band, and you hear that vibe, you can find it into the roots so deep.
that's fair. I don't know that I've ever heard them, but I know that people love CCR, and I never really could. It was just never for me.
Right.
But the stuff that you're saying is super interesting. Like, I never really thought about the Acadians getting sent down south because when is that ever going to come up when you're a typical white boy coming up through the Montreal school system, the English Montreal school system, which is
Yeah, for sure.
already kind of weird inside of Quebec. So it's like, I never thought about that really. And then the migration patterns of people like that. But I guess that's a lot more prevalent in your world.
Yeah, and you know, the land always influences the music, right? It's the way it is. Our languages, if you look at the Mi'kmaq language or the Mohawk language, you know, all of the different nations, their language is directly related to the land. Now, when you start making music, you use your language. So it's music from the land, right?
Mm.
So it comes from there. So when you go from one place to the other place, you're finding music of that land. And for sure, when you get down into Bayou country, you're gonna get Bayou music, and those bayous are all around the East Coast, you know. So it's influenced there too. And there's such a mix of culture, you know. The Acadians, first of all, to be Acadian, you're a mix of every goddamn race on the planet, right? You just mixed up everything, right? And then you got the Acadian people mixing with the Mi'kmaq people, and then there's a trade of culture. So there's so much trade of culture, even to the way the dressing and the sound of the music. It just gets really, really interesting, and it's rich and it's cool.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. That's partly why we're going through it like this. That's why it's Bridge the Gap, because a lot of us don't know a lot of things, or at least, and to think, like, you're geographically closer to me than so many people that's culture might be more similar to mine, but realistically, it's like an apples and oranges existence. Like in the 80s, I'm born in 87, right? So, like, okay, I didn't grow up in the 80s like that, but still a little bit after. I'm in the middle of
Yeah,
Montreal. We're complaining about getting music like a year late or movies 8 months late. You're like, I'm not connected. Like,
dude.
that's a completely different reality.
Yeah,